Thanks, Stefan. I also want to thank Will Wallach for putting in a good word, getting me here to talk about capitalism, democratic solidarity, and institutional design. I'm not going to say too much about capitalism, at least not at first, and only indirectly. I want to say a lot about democratic solidarity and institutional design, though. I want to try to weave together some of the threads that Stefan and Mark have spun out for us. I think there are a lot of connections here, and it's development in our increasingly globalized economy. I'm going to be concentrating on ideal theory as opposed to the non-ideal. And I particularly want to focus on what a liberal democracy would look like. When we think of existential challenges like climate change or nuclear war and things like that, we have to call into question the point for which institutions exist. And certainly human survival is well, it would be the first virtue of institutions. But if we assume that we are in what we could call the circumstances of justice, where cooperation is both necessary and possible, we can ask, what do we want our institutions to look like? In other words, bracket the question of our extinction or survival. And just assume that we can live well if we cooperate, but if we're going to live well, we have to cooperate. Then what comes into view is that we would like our institutions to be just, on the assumption that they will keep us alive, not just through our own natural lives, complete natural lives, but also from generation to generation. And this was the question that John Rawls formulated in his 1971 book, A Theory of Justice. And his argument there was that if we ask ourselves, what rules would we accept to live by together, cooperatively, viewing society as a fair scheme of cooperation for a mutual benefit from generation to generation, are there any rules that we could agree to if we didn't peek at what we stood to gain from the choice of one set of rules or another? In other words, if we put ourselves in an original position behind a veil of ignorance, where we didn't know whether we were strong or weak, smart or not smart, interested in the arts or interested in sports, in fact, not really aware of what our conception of a good life would look like. Are there any rules that we would agree to as fair to govern our lives together? And he argued that we would accept two principles in a certain order. That we would insist on absolute guarantee of certain basic equal liberties. Freedom of conscience, freedom of speech, the political liberties, freedom of the press, freedom of association, later added freedom of occupational choice. We would insist upon certain property rights. We would insist on the right to bodily integrity. We would insist on the right to own personal property. He later added that we would insist on a right to own residential property. But we would not, he said, at the level of principle, insist upon any particular rights as to what he called the means of production. Not at the matter of principle. The second principle contained two parts. First part, fair equality of opportunity. We would insist not just on formal opportunity to occupy positions of influence and advantage. We would insist that all at a given level of talent and motivation would have a roughly equal chance to fulfill their ambitions to hold positions in society, however defined. Secondary in position to the principle of fair equality of opportunity was the famous, or I would say, notorious difference principle. The principle that whatever remaining inequalities of wealth and income were generated by this society, this fair cooperative scheme for mutual benefit, would be divided in a way such that inequalities benefited all, the least advantaged included, with the assumption that what benefits the least advantaged will, in a sort of chain-connected way, benefit all intermediate segments of the economic scale. The difference principle, for many, seemed to be the Rawlsian message. And this is very unfortunate. The reception of Rawls throughout North America and Europe put an emphasis on this that I don't think Rawls intended. I'm certain he did not intend. It's in its application, it's too easily confused with tropes, metaphors that he would have firmly repudiated, such as the rising tide raises all boats metaphor, the trickle-down metaphor. We don't care about inequalities as long as they're to the benefit of all. It was a mantra that was repeated again and again in the crucial early 1970s and came to be adopted even by the presumably left parties in the United States and Britain. We don't care about inequality. There's nothing wrong with being big so long as all are benefited. We shouldn't talk about distribution. We should talk about growing the pie. This was not Rawls's idea. This was not Rawls's theory. What was too often overlooked, and I think is still not sufficiently appreciated, is that the difference principle occupies a secondary and subordinate position in his theory. What Rawls said about the first principle, equality of political liberties, has gone sadly unappreciated. Rawls distinguished between the worth of a liberty and formal equality of that liberty. The formal equality of a liberty does not assure its equal worth to all persons, irrespective of their economic position. The right to own a newspaper means a lot more to someone in a position to buy one than it does to a person who doesn't have the money even to buy an issue of the morning paper. Rawls insisted that assuming a well-ordered society in which the principles of justice are publicly known, publicly understood, and are generally conformed to, and known to be conformed to by all members of society, that the equal political liberties would have to have a fair value in addition to merely formal equality. Let me explain this. Suppose that we all have liberty of conscience and we can all choose our religious devotion. And some of us choose to follow religions that require expensive pilgrimages and expensive donations as a matter of religious doctrine. It may be that the value of religious liberty is much less in the hands of someone with less money because they're unable to go on the pilgrimages, unable to pay the tithes and so forth. That's just too bad in Rawls's view. We have to take responsibility for our choice of our conception of the good life. And if we choose a religious discipline that makes these kinds of expensive demands, that's just a matter of expensive tastes. We have to take responsibility for that. But that doesn't apply. That same reasoning can't apply to the political liberties. Rawls insisted that the political liberties could not be left in a merely formal state of equality. They had to be substantively fair. What he called the fair value of the political liberties was a first principle guarantee required by his theory of justice as fairness. Now this is easy to say but profound in its implications. And Rawls was aware that it would not be institutionally easy to realize fair equality of political liberty. It would require institutional provisions of roughly two kinds. One kind would be a limit on the degree of accumulation of wealth. Notice that the difference principle does not place itself any limit on the degree of economic inequality. If I can trace a couple of curves in space for the camera, if we think of this 45-degree line as representing equality, and we think of the well-being in terms of income and wealth of the less advantaged on the y-axis and that of the most advantaged on the x-axis, assuming there are only two groups in society, reasonable persons, reasonable choosers in the original position would not insist upon staying on the 45-degree line. Although the design in the original position is such that each is represented as an equal, it would be irrational to insist on leveling down the degree of economic inequality when greater well-being for all could be attained by allowing a degree of inequality. That degree of inequality might come about, for example, by the need to provide provisions to get certain persons with talents to exercise those talents. For example, the first principle, liberty of occupational choice, means that a person who has great skill as a surgeon cannot be justly compelled to practice surgery. If she has a preference for spending some time on her allotment, tending her secret garden, she has to be, in a free society, enticed to do so one way or the other. The standard way of doing that is offering her a higher salary, offering her more to agree to work for more hours. We would agree to principles that permitted that because we realize that to make that incentive real, she has to be allowed to keep that extra salary. We can't just tax it back in order to guarantee equality. So in the original position, rational persons would choose the difference principle rather than the principle of strict equality when it comes to distribution, the residual distribution of income and wealth. That means there are going to be wealthier people, and there are going to be people that have greater incomes. If that enables them to buy art, create art, go on pilgrimages, give generously to charities, that's something that no one can complain injustice about. But what Rawls denied was that we would be willing to allow economic inequality to the degree that it jeopardized the fair equality of political liberty. That is, at a given level of aptitude and motivation, no one should have greater political influence merely because he or she has greater material resources, greater wealth. The one way to guarantee that is to limit the accumulation of wealth. There's not great accumulation of wealth, then there's not, to that degree anyway, a danger of the perversion or infiltration of the political process by that unequal accumulation. And the suggestions, we just tossed these off, tax inheritances at the recipient level. Let those that are better off accumulate, and if they want to give it all away, they're free to give it all away, but each person who receives more than a certain amount would see that taxed away or reduced dramatically by taxation. So if, I'm just picking an example out of the air now, a Fred Trump wants to convey a real estate empire to his children, he's free to do that. He might not have worked as hard and been as applied his ingenuity to the matter of improving the great city of New York had he not had that incentive. But upon his death, his children, or those who he chooses to favor, will have to pay most of that to the Treasury. That's one way we can tolerate economic inequality while preserving the fair value of political liberty. And of course, other kinds of taxation would be options as well. Another way of preserving the fair value of political liberty would be to try to insulate the political process from the influence of wealth, particularly the unequal influence of wealth. And this might be achieved by public funding of electoral campaigns, expenditure caps for political candidates, contribution caps on contributors. Rawls pulled back from the edge of the program that I think Stefan has proposed for us to go further in pursuing. He didn't want to get into institutional design. He said, I will assume provisionally that there are ways of tolerating economic inequality while preserving not just the integrity of the political process in some more nebulous sense, but at the same time protecting the fair value of political liberty, its rough equality of political influence, holding aptitude and interest fixed. Obviously, if someone is uninterested in politics, then they shouldn't expect to be as influential as those who are political junkies. So also those who are marble-mouthed and fuzzy-headed should not expect to have as much political influence as those who are clear-headed and articulate. But we should be able to expect that if we try as hard and are as good at political argument, we ought to be able to compete fairly, on fairly equal terms, with others having equally matched skills, even if we happen to be the rich one and they the poor one, or vice versa. This is something that I will refer to as political equality. Rawls insisted on a first principle guarantee of political equality. And the great puzzle, I think it's brought out very vividly in Mark's presentation, is how do you reconcile economic inequality with political equality? Are they mutually compatible? Is there some institutional design that can reconcile the two? If that were possible, then presumably that in itself would be solidaristic, in the sense that all citizens would have the confidence that they had as much of a say in political decisions as anyone else. At the same time that they enjoyed the liberal freedoms that we moderns are so fond of. So that's Rawls's view. My question is, why the special treatment for the political liberties? Why pick them out in this way? Why shouldn't political influence be like any other kind of influence, like theological influence or cultural influence? What's the argument for the fair value of political liberties is the question that I've tried to satisfy for myself. If Rawls doesn't have a good argument, who does? But then what is Rawls's argument? We can't say whether it's a good argument without knowing what it is, and this is one of the many mysteries of Rawlsian scholarship is, what is the argument? I think we can agree that there has to be an argument. Right? Rawls would be the first to agree that there have to be reasons that are evident in the original position that would compel the choosers to insist upon fair value of political liberty without insisting on it for any of the other, perhaps more preferred first principle liberties. This had better be good, in other words, Professor Rawls. Rawls himself acknowledged that the difference in the liberties. When we think of the liberties of the ancients, the Athenians, we think of their devotion to political participation, the birthplace of democracy. Forget the 40,000 slaves out there extracting silver for you to support your contemplative and political lifestyle. Forget the women back there who were taking care of the home. That's their proper. Once we have to do a lot of setting aside when we do political philosophy. We have to ignore a number of warts. Some of our great thinkers have had associations that would be embarrassing if they were placed in a time machine and brought here, or they would come to see them as embarrassments. No, we moderns, some of us, many of us, just don't want to hang out, in the agora, disputing momentous issues of the day. Or if we do, we realize that, there are others whom we respect and think very highly of who would just rather tend their secret gardens and have no particularly strong interest in politics. The liberties of the moderns are, let's say, the right to be left alone, to pursue our own projects, set our own goals in life, and to do so without interference. So this makes it harder to understand why these relatively often less valued liberties should be guaranteed their fair value, while these other liberties, which for many of us, and quite reasonably, are thought more important, well, if we can't afford those that we choose, we're just to accept responsibility for our expensive tastes. What's the argument that would incline us to accept that sort of prima facie paradox? And I'm just going to try to, as quickly as I can, and painlessly as I can, rehearse the argument. First, though, I want to point out something about Rawls's understanding about the political process. He was influenced by political scientist Robert Dahl at Yale, who made an interesting distinction between the three stages of any democratic process. We think of democracy as a matter of voting, a matter of electoral politics. But Rawls read Dahl and noted that there are really three stages, rough stages, significantly different stages. There's a pre-voting stage and there's a post-voting stage. In addition to the going to the polls or getting one's thumb ink purple or whatever the ritual is. It's a ritual that we can't really understand fully why we participate in, given the fact that we are very unlikely to break a tie or create one when we go to the polls. And there's a great deal of discussion and controversy about interference with the electoral process, or the Russians, fooling with the voting machines and so forth. That's part of the problem, part of the picture, but that can be misleading. A very important part of the pre-voting stage is the setting of a voting agenda. Stalin is supposed to have said it doesn't matter who casts the votes. What matters is who counts the votes. I don't think Stalin said that. Stalin was too devilishly clever. What matters is who decides who the candidates are. What matters is who sets the agenda. That's pre-voting. Rawls's fair value guarantee is an insistence that all of us have roughly equal political influence at the pre-voting stage. If we want to propose an item for discussion, for it to be put to a vote, we should each have the same chance of doing that, regardless of how much money we have or how little money we have. So also there's a post-voting stage. We vote for something, and then it's a further question whether that even the successful candidate is installed in office, or if it's a ballot measure, whether that particular proposal is enacted. Some of us, for example, having greater wealth, might decide that, if we don't like that tax measure, that tax increase, we'll just lay off workers, or we'll just close our plants and move production elsewhere. That's a kind of political influence. Rawls doesn't expressly address this, but there's no reason not to understand the fair value guarantee is applying to the post-voting stage as well. So this is a very strong and very consequential element of his political philosophy that unfortunately has not been paid much attention to until I think fairly recently. But why this is making it sound even less plausible. Fair value for a liberty of the ancients, and we're not ancient. A set of institutions that in Rawls's own admission, never seem to have been seriously attempted in any modern constitutional democracy, leave aside the ancients. And it seems to be not something that's obvious to intuition. A very prominent liberal, Ronald Dworkin, rejected the idea that there should be political equality in this sense. Now, Dworkin's discussion of this is somewhat marred by the fact that he didn't take seriously Rawls's stipulation that we were assuming equal levels of motivation and aptitude. He took political equality as requiring the silly equality of influence between the political junkie and the person who couldn't be bothered to register, much less to vote. That's not what Rawls meant. Of course, we don't know what Dworkin thought Rawls meant, because Dworkin was not the sort of person who would directly engage other thinkers who had worked similar territory. But Dworkin has a very good point that's made an impression on a number of people. Look, if we do equality otherwise correctly, who cares? Why do you have to have equal political influence if it's possible that you'd be better off without it? You might not be interested in it, and you might screw things up, because we're all fallible. We're all subject to bias, various kinds of limitations in our rationality operate on all of us. What's the argument? Now, I'm going to quickly summarize this so that there can be some discussion here. But Rawls was generally, I think, widely believed to have insisted that on fair value political equality because it was essential to self-respect. And this is the sort of Rousseauvian, could be thought of as a Rousseauvian idea, that we want to see our equality affirmed as widely as possible, otherwise our feelings might be hurt. But that's not available to Rawls in his argumentative setup. As he arranges his argument, at stage one of the argument, we're to set aside the special psychologies of envy, greed, spite. We're to take no interest in the interests of others. All we are interested in is maximizing our return of primary goods that are objectively measurable. Now, Rawls at some point says that self-respect is the most important of the primary goods, but he also says we probably don't want to include them in that group because it messes up the objectivity of the measure. Wealth, we can measure. Income, we can measure. Freedom of speech, a little bit rougher, but still measurable, objectively determinable. We can tell when we're being censored. Okay, it's sometimes harder to tell whether we're being respected. So Rawls has to draw on something other than self-respect, even though it may be true and certainly available to him elsewhere in the argument. At stage two of the original position procedure, he will bring in the special psychology, but just as a way of checking to make sure that the first stage principles are livable. I'm going to skip over, because of time here, I'm going to skip over what I call the intolerable risk strand of argument. Because I think the stronger strand of argument emphasizes what I will call stability. And stability is a quality of political conceptions. It's a lot like solidarity creating. And the way to understand stability in Rawlsian terms is to sort of go back to his understanding of citizens of a well-ordered society as possessing two moral powers: conception of the good and a sense of justice. Conception of the good meaning their own personal goal in life. And we might go through several different conceptions of the good in the course of maturing. A comprehensive conception might be something that has a religious basis. Okay? We can't impose this on each other. That would be unreasonable. It would be incompatible with the first principle, liberty of conscience. Sense of justice, this is easily misunderstood because it sounds as though it's just an individual psychological trait. Some people, as individuals at a very young age, attain Kohlberg's third stage of development, or fourth stage, or whatever it is, Piaget, whatever it is, where they see themselves as a person among other persons and develop an appreciation for fairness in treatment of even persons they don't have close ties to. What Rawls means is a shared sense of justice, where the shared has to be understood. It's like a silent letter in pneumonia. A shared sense of justice is, of course, a sense of justice in the vernacular sense, but it's also a confidence that all others in one society, assuming society isolated, self-sufficient, they share our principles, and they also share our understanding that we are all fallible in our understanding of their application. We are nonetheless convinced that we're, as it were, reading from the same page. Essentially, the stability argument is that a society is stable to the degree that there's a kind of congruence between each individual's comprehensive conception of the good and their sense of justice. First of all, there's no contradiction, right? It's not going to contradict my faith if I am tolerant of persons of other faiths. That's congruence. If we think of the comparison between a conception of justice, including a fair value guarantee, and one that's just like it without the fair value guarantee, just like it, same first principle liberties, except no fair value guarantee for political liberties, same fair equality of opportunity, same difference principles, just this one little change, no fair value. What else changes? And I think Rawls's argument has to be understood as pointing out that we don't have the same congruence anymore. Because political power is coercive power. To the extent that others have an advantage over us owing to their greater wealth or income, they have the ability to shape and reshape the social world that we inhabit together. And they can do that in ways that impair our ability to live the lives that we choose. Why would we risk giving up our equal say in determining our common world? Why would we? Well, we might think, well, you know, let the wiser heads captain the ship, just like Mill said. We all recognize that some have special aptitudes. Why not just turn it over to them? I think the answer to that is that, well, we have different ideas about who those captains are. Surely we want to have an equal say in choosing the captains. Why would we hazard it to leave to someone else? Simply on the basis of their having more money, more wealth, they get to say. Now, there are, of course, times and places where it was thought that, of course, the wealthy have greater political power. They know affairs. They are men of the world mostly. Well, they're all men of the world, just these men with the money. That's not, if you didn't know that you were one of those men, why would you ever choose a principle that would tolerate that? You would have to understand that my conception of the good may get squeezed out, may never be represented at all because of choices not made in a fair democratic way, but made by persons who happen to be more influential only because we allowed them to accumulate greater wealth and income because it's better for all in terms of greater wealth and income, but possibly not in other ways. The wealthy might, one example I use in the full paper is, why would a farmer must realize that political power might be exercised in ways that made an agrarian way of life impossible. Well, surely she or he would insist on having an equal say in the decisions affecting that. Might lose democratically. That's always a risk. But unless he or she had that equal say, her conception of the good might not be congruent with the sense of justice. The shared sense of justice might mean that her conception of justice turned out to be threatened, precarious. And so to that degree, a society lacking a fair value guarantee would be less solidaristic, I would say less stable and less solidaristic, where the solidarity comes through the shared conception of justice. We are sure that we are each, as it were, speaking from the same page, only when we have an equal say in determining what derives from what's on that page. So I'll cut it off there.